What is the Second Amendment and what does it really mean? The Second Amendment is the Second Amendment to the Constitution that the Founding Fathers wrote, next to free speech and freedom of religion, freedom of and from. Um, it was to ensure that the people could control its government in a tyrannical situation like what people of those days had experienced with England, thus the American Revolution. You can research all that if you don't know much about it. I mean, go research it. Um, that's the sole purpose for the Second Amendment, is for the people to be able to have the last chance of defense of their country against their own government. We also use the Second Amendment um, to guarantee that we can defend ourselves like Ukraine is having to do now. Imagine Ukraine if they'd have had weapons the whole time. Maybe, just maybe, Russia would have said, not today. Um, because why do I think that? Because we've seen that before. The Emperor of China asked, no, not China, I'm sorry, Japan, during World War II, asked one of his lead generals what it would take to invade the United States. And the general replied, it's impossible. There's a gun under every blade of grass, which means all the people are armed and they're all going to fight. It's going to be horrible. See, Putin, yes, he's doing what he's doing, but he didn't expect to get what he got. But anyway, back to the Second Amendment here. How do we know that's what the Founding Fathers meant for it? It's written all over the Federalist Papers. Letters and transcripts back and forth from each other. John Adams, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hancock, blah, 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 Henry, etc. Talking about why the people should be armed. There was a few that were skeptical. I think John Adams was one of them. I'm not sure, but I think he was kind of skeptical. But that's what it was designed for, so that the people could overthrow a tyrannical government if need be, as a last resort of fighting off tyranny. The Second Amendment reads this. It says, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, a lot of people confuse militia with military or National Guard, which the National Guard was not even a thing in those days, in the 1700s. There was no standing army either. The militia was you and I, the people. George Washington was not a president. There were no Congress. They were under British rule. And they declared independence and later wrote a Second Amendment because they had seen what the British would do, busting in your house in the middle of the day or night to search for something or someone, violating all kinds of rights, thus becoming tyrannical. That's why we have the Second Amendment, to fight a tyrannical government, our own, if we have to. The Second Amendment, a lot of people argue, oh, well, that was for, guns of the day. That's what, when it was wrote, there's no way the Founding Fathers would have known that we would have AR-15s. Well, there was machine guns back then, believe it or not. Look it up. There's historic proof of that. It's in museums. It wasn't a everyday thing, and no, they weren't all over the place, but they were there. But that's not the point. The point is, muskets were used by the military at the time because that's what they had, the British military. So George Washington would not, and any of the other founding fathers who wrote the Second Amendment and talked about the Second Amendment, would not have said, oh, we'll just make it only muskets. It was to fight a tyrannical government with whatever they had, we should have. So why would they say only muskets, or even think that way? The Second Amendment clearly states the right of the people to keep and bear arms, which means if you're bearing arms, that means you're carrying arms. That means you're allowed to have a gun on you. But you can't exactly run home and go get your rifles and go fight your tyrannical government. Although, a lot of people seem to think that the insurrectionists of January 6th were attempting to overthrow the Capitol building, a building, with no guns. So, maybe they have a point, but it's on top of their head. Anyway, that's what the Second Amendment's for. We don't want to get rid of that. We see countries that, look at Justin Trudeau in Canada. Now you can't even have a gun. You can't have a pistol. Lucky for them, Canada's relatively safe, but doesn't mean it's always going to be. The Second Amendment was not created so that we could protect ourselves from each other, because that was kind of a accepted thing. It wasn't written anything about hunting either, because that was an accepted thing. People of that day knew, of course there's scoundrels out there, of course there's robbers and thieves and horrible people who will do horrible things. Of course you're going to have a gun. Everybody had a gun back then. People had guns. So of course they didn't include that in the Second Amendment. Oops, sorry, dropped you again. Of course they didn't include that in the Second Amendment because they didn't feel the need that they had to, just like they didn't include hunting. Didn't feel the need that they should include that. Why? That'd be like saying you have the right to breathe. Of course you do. But they wanted to make it clear to the government, the future governments, they didn't even trust themselves as government, much less the future governments. They wanted to make sure that governments knew. Look what happened to Native Americans. I mean, the Trail of Tears and Andrew Jackson, etc. I mean, Geronimo put up a good fight, but would that happen today? Maybe, maybe not. But I'd sure as hell rather have the opportunity to defend myself and my way of life than to just lay down in front of a tank and let it roll over me to prove a point. I don't want to do that. But anyway, that's my opinion on the Second Amendment. The main, maybe even the sole purpose of the Second Amendment is to keep a tyrannical government in check. If it can keep an emperor of Japan, a world power at the time, in check, maybe it can keep its own government in check. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks a bunch.